So the other day I ordered dinner, and for those who don't know, Domino's has a pizza tracker app on their website. It looks like this, and it lets you see where your order's at in the pizza making process. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder how this works. I did some research and I found a ton of posts and comments saying that this was basically just a timer, and that it actually doesn't reflect where your order's currently at. However, I found a couple posts that suggest that is completely false. So I tried to build it, and this is what I came up with. So here's my pizza tracker, and we have our 5 steps, and if I go behind the scenes and change it from baking to checking, we can see here that it'll actually update in real time. So what does it take to make this? Well, let's get cooking. So we're going to use 3 different technologies to build this. We're going to use Laravel as our backend API, React as our front-end framework, and Inertia as the glue between the two. It'll act like a client-side framework, but you can use your server-side code to manage it. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go. So first things first, let's get a project started. Okay, so I'm in this directory. Let's go ahead and start a new Laravel project by using composer create project, Laravel in the current directory. Just a quick note, I'm going to start from scratch for this demo, but if you want to see just the public-facing tracker part, feel free to skip ahead using the chapters in the video description. And once that's finished up, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly edit our env file, and I'm going to change the database connection to SQLite. This will mean I don't have to set up a database locally and I can just use SQLite. So now I want to run the default migrations that come with Laravel, so we can use PHP Artisan migrate force, which will create that SQLite database in our local environment and run those migrations. Okay, let's clear this out. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to immediately install a starter kit for Laravel. So there are a couple that exist, and I'm going to go with the simplest one, which is Breeze. So composer require Laravel Breeze and the dev flag included in that. And not only will this provide for us a starting point for authentication, so logging in and registering for our application, but it'll also provide a starting point for Inertia and React, and I'll show you that in a second. So if we go ahead and run PHP Artisan breeze install, it'll ask us what stack we want to use for our application. So let's go ahead and choose React with Inertia. Would I like to add any optional features, dark mode, server-side rendering, or TypeScript? I'm going to keep all of these blank right now, so we'll just have it be as simple as possible. And we'll go ahead and use pest for testing. And this will run through the installation process. It'll run a couple composer commands, which we can see now. And then once that's done, it will start running some npm commands as well. And now it's going to run vite build, and the Breeze scaffolding has been set up successfully. So our application scaffold is good to go, and we can actually check it out if we go ahead and run PHP Artisan serve. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up another tab, and I'm going to run npm run dev, which will give us a vite hot reload server to look at our application through. So if we go ahead and open up localhost 8000, we can see our application up and ready, and we can log in or register with it as well right out of the box with Laravel Breeze. I'm going to go ahead and register for an account so I can see the authenticated section as well. Okay, so I registered and I'm automatically brought into this dashboard section, which only authenticated users can view. I also have out of the box a little section to update my profile information or delete my account. And let's go ahead and open up our source code and take a look at that. We have our controllers here, which we got a profile controller from Breeze. We have this whole auth controller section also from Breeze, which gives us the ability to register users, verify their email addresses, and just a bunch of boilerplate for authentication that we don't have to write ourselves. But the interesting part is if we open up our resources folder here, we go to our views, we only have 2 of them. We have this welcome view, which is what you would normally see whenever the application boots up in its landing page to begin with, and we have this app blade file. And it has a couple different blade directives in here. So we have some of these script directives, routes, vite react refresh, vite scripts, inertia head, and then we have this @inertia directive down here. This is the entry point for our application's components. So just like if you were creating a React app out of the box normally, or a Vue app, you'd usually have some kind of entry point div like with an ID of app, and this would be the access point for the rest of your single page application. But instead, Inertia uses something that's particular to each framework. For Laravel, that is this Inertia blade directive. Speaking of views though, where is the rest of our application? Where are our pages that contain this dashboard content or our profile page as well? Like, where does that reside? So if we go back to our resources folder and go to the JS folder, we can see we have a lot more than what normally comes with Laravel. So we have an app.jsx file, we have a pages, layouts, and components directories as well. And all of these are used to build out our application. So it starts with a page. So if we open up this dashboard.jsx file here, we can see that we're using a React functional component called dashboard, and it has an auth prop passed into it. But okay, how does this component get injected into the dashboard view that we see here? Well, that's kind of where the beauty of inertia comes in at, is that it uses your backend framework's flow already. So in Laravel, if we weren't using a single page application, if we were just using Blade, we'd have a route, and we can see that if we go to our routes web file, and we'd call it something like dashboard. And here it is here. But instead of normally returning something like view dashboard, where it would correspond to a dashboard blade file, we use this inertia render method and then pass in a component name. So this component lies up with this React component here. And so what happens is whenever somebody views this dashboard route, initially this inertia render method will return back a compiled view consisting of this app blade file, and then the injected component as well as the data required from it automatically serialize inside of the markup. So if we go back to our dashboard page, let's go ahead and open up the source for it. You can see down here we have a div with an ID of app, and we have a data page attribute associated with it with a pretty large JSON string attached to it. But what happens is whenever this is finally rendered up, the client hydrates this and creates the view that you are seeing here. But that changes for subsequent visits. So on the initial load, like I said, so let's go ahead and refresh this. We see that we're doing a full page refresh. We're getting this dashboard view as a block of HTML. But if we go ahead and visit another page, like let's say our profile, we can see that it was an asynchronous visit like a single page application. So if we scroll down here, we can actually see the call to the profile route, and the response back from it was a JSON object containing the component that's used to render this page, as well as the props object for that page. But you don't have to have a separate API and make calls to get user information like you would in a traditional single page application. You can use your backend framework's routing and pass in props like you normally would to Blade or whatever the Rails equivalent is. And on the back end, this looks like a typical Laravel application. So we have a route here that just returns, instead of a view, inertia render. And that's what all of our profile routes do as well. If we go to this profile controller here, we can see that these are just returning inertia render. And anything that's passed in like you normally would for a Blade template gets put into the props section of this component. So if we go to the profile edit component, we can see here that we have 3 props: auth, must verify email, and status. So auth is passed in automatically, but the must verify email and status are passed in with these array keys here. So yeah, inertia is a really cool way of building single page applications without the redundancy that you would normally have from having to write both an API and the front end routing logic at the same time. So okay, let's continue on and build our application. So let's get out of everything that we have here, our folders, and just go back to the beginning. So we're making pizzas and we want to show somebody what their current order's status is. So the first thing that we should do is create that model that's going to hold the data for us, so that pizza model. So if I go ahead and open up a terminal, I can run PHP artisan make model, and we'll call it pizza. And we'll pass in the migration flag as well to get us a migration file that we can use to create that table. So the first thing, let's go ahead and open up that create pizzas table migration and talk about what we're going to need here to store this pizza data. How about a foreign ID for the user model? So that way we can have some kind of ownership between a pizza and a person who's making it. How about a string for the size, a string for the crust type, a JSON array of the different toppings that can be used for a pizza, and then a string for the current status of it. So this looks pretty good. We can go ahead and exit this file. And if we open up our terminal again, we can run php artisan migrate to put that table into our database. So now that we have our database table actually set up, I think the best thing to do next would be to create a factory so that we can actually populate the database with some fake data. I don't know why I keep closing this, but let's go ahead and open up the terminal again, and we'll run php artisan make factory pizza factory and pass in the model flag of pizza. So it created our file for us. Now let's go ahead and open that up. And if we scroll down here to the definition, remembering again, we have a user ID, which is our user foreign key. We have a size, crust, toppings, and status. Okay. The easiest way that I do for factories like this is I know that I'm going to create 10 test users in my database. So I'm just going to use rand 1 through 10 and pick out a random user ID between those two integers. Ideally, not the greatest way to do this, but this will work in a pinch and it works for this test application. And so for our sizes, we can use Laravel's array random method, and we can pick out a random value from an array of possibilities. And then likewise for the crust, we're also going to use array random. The toppings, we'll get to that in a little bit. That's going to be an array, but I'd like it to have some kind of variability in it. So we'll tackle that in a second. And the status is also pretty simple. We'll also just use a random amount of values. Now, normally whenever a factory's ran, just like saving a model in the database any other way, it'll have an auto-incrementing integer ID. But I don't want to have any small number ones because it just doesn't look good on the back end. So instead, I want to create the ID itself, and I want to have some kind of randomness thrown in here. So we're going to use rand again, and I'll give it a value anywhere between 11111 and 99999. There will always be a 5-digit random ID associated with a particular model. Okay, so for the toppings, I want to have a list of choices, and then I want to have an array that's given to this model based on like 1 to 4 of those choices. So let's go ahead and create some basic topping choices here in an array. Now what I want to do is have a final toppings array and put in some kind of random amount of these choices in this array. So I think the best way to do that is I'm just going to create a basic for loop, and then we will add to our toppings array a random selection from our topping choices. Now, because we're pulling this out randomly each time, there could be duplicate values in this. So in order to combat that, I'm going to run array unique on those toppings. Oop, I missed the I here. So this will get us a unique array of hopefully 1 to 4 toppings to use for our pizza. And then we'll replace that attribute with the value from that array. So our factory looks good, but we have to have a way to use it. And so that's where our database seeder class will come in here. So like I said earlier, I want to create 10 different users in our application at least. So here's that user factory creating 10 of them. And then let's go ahead and also create 10, not 10, let's do 20 fake pizza models as well. Opening up our terminal, PHP artisan, db seed. And we are getting an array to string conversion. I know why that is. So let's go ahead and exit out of this. And the problem with that is if we look at the create pizzas migration that we just did, our toppings are stored as a JSON string, but we are passing them through to the database as an array. And we can combat this by opening up our pizza model. So while we're here, let's go ahead and make a couple of changes to this. First of all, let's set the protected guarded attribute to an empty array. This means that no attributes coming in will be guarded. We can pass in whatever data attributes that we want whenever we're saving a model. And then we have a relationship between users and pizzas, so we can go ahead and add that in here too. Public function user, return this belongs to the user class. And then to combat that JSON issue, we can say protected casts is equal to an array, and this takes a associative array where the key is a database column or attribute. So we have our toppings column, and then the value for that is how you want that to be casted. In Laravel, this essentially means that it'll do some kind of calculations or transformations between the data that's actually residing in the database and how it's presented in your application. So if we say that this is casted as an array, what that means is that the data will have the value of an array in the backend codebase in Laravel, but whenever it's put into the database, it is serialized as JSON. So let's go ahead and try to run that db seed again. PHP artisan db seed. Our database was seeded and everything is fine. So now I think it's time to create an area in the dashboard to actually look at those. So let's exit out of what we have here now, and let's go ahead and open up our routes web file. So we have this whole middleware auth group already, and that is perfect. So let's go ahead and create a new route, and we'll just call it pizzas, and it'll use a new controller. So I'll keep that blank for now, and we'll give it a name of pizzas index. Now let's go ahead and create that controller. So in our terminal, PHP artisan make controller, pizza controller. And so now we can provide that controller here. And we'll use the index method to get all of the pizzas. Let's go ahead and open up that pizza controller and create that method. And let's talk about what needs to be returned here. Because if we just go ahead and return pizza all, we can go ahead and view this in our local environment. So if we go ahead and open up this view, instead of dashboard, we type in pizzas, we can see here that we have a JSON object of 20 pizzas, but that's not what I want to see. I want to see a view like our dashboard, but full of pizzas in like a table. So we're going to need that inertia render that we had seen earlier, and we're going to need to create a component to hold this information. So let's go ahead and create a variable out of these pizzas here, because we're going to need to pass that in. And then we can just return inertia render, and then a component name. Now, because we might have more than one screen for this, I think it's good to keep this in its own folder. So let's call the component pizzas all. And we don't need to specify any kind of file suffix for this component, just the name. And then we need to pass in any props along with it. So for us, that is the pizzas. And now if we go ahead and try to run this, we get a blank screen. We don't get any kind of error that the component doesn't exist until we inspect our console. Then we can see that we have a uncaught exception down here that the page wasn't found, pizzasall.jsx. Now right now, there's no artisan command to do this automatically. So what we'll have to do is go to our resources folder, the pages directory, and create that JSX file automatically. So pizzas all.jsx, and let's scaffold out a basic React functional component. So this is the most basic component that we could create. And if we go ahead and save this, we can see in the browser that it is displaying the information that we want. The problem is though, is that we want it to be part of the dashboard, and we also want information passed through to this to display on the front end. So we can go ahead and add both of those in here with our props. So we have auth automatically injected so we can get the user's information, but we also have our pizzas prop that we passed in through the controller earlier. And now we need to make it part of the dashboard. Well, if we look at the dashboard component, we can see that it is nested inside of this authenticated layout component here. So let's go ahead and just copy this and use it for our other section. So now if we go back, we can see that we have a page in the dashboard and it says all pizzas, but we still have this you're logged in section down here, which we'll update with a table in a little bit. One thing though is that we don't have a navigation to this section yet. So let's go ahead and create one of those real quick. And because we're using Breeze, that's actually already included in here. If we look at the layouts section for the authenticated layout component and we scroll down, we can see that we have a nav link component as well that's going to our dashboard. Now, if we go ahead and follow this component, we can see here that it is using a link component coming from Inertia's React library. And the reason for that over something just like a basic Ahref is because the link component is the heart of how React uses its routing system. So whenever one of these links is clicked, it intercepts that URL that you're trying to go to and makes that request asynchronously to give that kind of single page application functionality. So let's go back to our authenticated layout and we'll create a new link. We'll just copy this one down here for our pizzas section. So we'll just call it pizzas. The route we're going to is pizzas index. And we want it to be active if the route is currently at any pizzas endpoint or any pizzas named route. And now you might be noticing that we are using a Laravel named route inside of a React component using this route method. And it's because we're using a package called Ziggy, which is automatically inserted into a lot of these Laravel starter kits that use inertia. It's by Titan, and it basically lets you use your Laravel named routes inside of JavaScript. So you can use it for TypeScript, you can use it for Vue and React applications, and it's really cool. It lets you use named routes just like you would inside of Laravel, but inside of any JavaScript application. Let's go ahead and save this, and we can see that back in our dashboard, we have a now active route under pizzas, and we can go back and forth between our dashboard and pizzas, and everything is working perfectly smoothly. The next thing that we need to do, though, is actually scaffold out this table down here where I want to list all of the information for each of our models. So let's exit out of what we have here, and we'll just focus on this pizzas all component right now. So I have this table component that I pulled from Flowbyte. I'll link it in the description. And it basically gives us access to 4 props that we can use to create a table using Tailwind, and then go through and map each item to a row in the table. So now back in our main component, I can get rid of this "you're logged in" section here, and I can use that table component and then pass in some of these props. So our items are our pizzas, columns we'll need to create, the primary name for the ID, I'll call that order number, and then we need an action as well, which I don't have yet. So let's go ahead and fill some of these in. So we have the items coming in. That is the pizzas prop that we pass in from the actual controller here, which again gets to us from this eloquent method. No API calls and no fetch requests, but we need to create a list of columns that we want displayed in this table from that data. Let's go ahead and create a const columns array, and we'll pull in size and status. So now let's provide the columns attribute, our columns array. Now for the action, this is a link that should be at the end of every row of the table. And usually this is like an edit the model or view more details about it. For our case, I want to be able to go in and edit the status of each of these orders. So we'll call this pizzas edit. We'll create a route called pizzas edit. Let's go ahead and just create a placeholder for that now. So we'll create a route that gets us to a particular model using that route model binding from Laravel. And this will go to our edit method inside of our pizza controller. And we'll call this pizzas edit. And while I'm here, we'll also go ahead and create a patch method for whenever that data will be saved. And we'll call that pizzas update. So I think we have all of our pieces together. Now let's see what this looks like on the front end. Okay, so we have the size, the status, and the order number for all of our different models. And if we go ahead and view details for these, we get a pop-up that says the pizza controller edit method does not exist inside of our controller file. And this is something else that's pretty cool about inertia, is that because we're using these link components inside of here, it pops up any errors inside of this model view here instead of forcing a reload of the page you're trying to go to. So you can easily exit out of here and be in the same state that you were just in. Something feels like it's missing from here though, and I would like to see the username of the person who is currently associated, the user who's associated with each order. So let's go back in here, and I could do something like, where is it? Columns. I could do something like, I don't know, user here. But the problem with that is that there is no user attribute inside of our model. I could pull one in by saying pizza with user and then get, but that'll add in a ton of information underneath that user to pull in the whole user model for each pizza model. But I'd like it to just be a single extra attribute called like chef or something. And we can actually do that. If we open up our pizza model, we can create a new section called appends, protected appends, and that takes an array as well of computed properties, things that are generated from data that's in the database, but are not physically stored in it. And so what I mean by that is if we have an appends called chef, then we need to create a function down here that generates this value that is attached to each pizza model. So if I create a public function called the get chef attribute, so I can return this user name, which will return just the name of the user association attached to this particular model. And that will automatically append it inside of each model whenever they're returned back to the front end. So without having to use a with or anything like that, every pizza model will have an associated chef with it, which is just the name of the attached user model. And we can see that if we go ahead and early return all of these pizza models, in the browser, we can see that we have a chef attribute now with just the name underneath of it. But there is a problem that you might notice, and that's we're getting a user object attached as well for each of these, which is something we didn't want in the first place. That's the whole reason why we added this chef attribute here. And the reason for that is because we need that attached user model to get the name, Laravel automatically appends it inside of each model anyway. But we can hide that pretty easily if you want to by creating a protected hidden attribute on the model as well, and then adding in the attributes that you don't want to be displayed whenever this data is returned back. So we can hide the user attribute and it'll still use the data associated with it that's pulled in, but the actual model will be hidden from the data. So refreshing back in our browser, we see that we have each of these models has a chef associated with it, but that user association, that whole user object is gone now. So, okay, let's go back to our controller, remove this early return, have everything back the way it was. And I didn't type hint this either. So this is an inertia response we're getting back. And okay, let's go ahead and see what this looks like now. Oh, we'll change this in the all. We'll change this from user to chef. And now if we refresh our front end, perfect. So we see our order, our size, our chef, and our status for each of our pizzas that are in our database. So what's next? Well, we need a way to edit each of these so we can change the status from something like prepping to baking or baking to checking. So we want to have this view details functionality added in. So if you remember, let's exit out of some of the stuff that we don't need right now. We added in both an edit and an update route to our main application routes file, but we didn't add the methods in the controller. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we have a public function edit. And because we're using route model binding, we are automatically getting this pizza model associated with the URL that's visited. So we don't have to use like pizza find from the ID. We are automatically getting a whole object back that is stored inside this pizza variable. And we want to render out another component to display some kind of edit page. So we'll return an inertia render method again. This time we'll call this pizza's edit. And we'll pass in a pizza prop, which is associated with the model that we are currently visiting. And like before, this returns back an inertia response. And then let's go ahead and add in the scaffold for our update function as well. So public function update, again, we are pulling in the pizza automatically with route model binding, but this time we need the request object as well, because we'll have to be pulling in some kind of saved form data in order to update that model. So we'll keep this here for now. Okay, so we need to create this form, this edit form for each of these pizzas. So let's tackle that next. Pizzas folder, let's create a new file and we'll call this edit.jsx. And this needs to be a basic form. And like our main pizzas dashboard view, this is also going to be extending that authenticated layout component. So we'll add in our user from the auth prop, and then we will go ahead and change the title of the page to reflect the uniqueness of each model. So we're using the ID here. And then let's go ahead and update the title of each of the pages as well using that same syntax. And we need some basic scaffolding that's available on the rest of the pages as well. So now if we go back to our dashboard, we can click on one of these view details buttons and it'll take us to a page associated with that particular order. So perfect, this is working exactly as we expected it to. But the problem though is that we need a form here. So instead of actually dumping everything into this section here, I'm going to abstract that out into a component of its own, kind of like the profiles section does down here. So we have this partials folder inside that has different form components that are used for the edit page. So I'm going to create a new component called, how about update pizza order form? So I went ahead and scaffolded out most of the markup, but let's quickly go through a little bit about what this component does. So again, React functional component here called update pizza order form. And we have a pizza and class name prop that's getting passed in through us. So the section starts out, we give the class name, the same class name that gets passed in. And then we have a header section here that shows we're looking for order information and some display flavor text as well. So all this is pretty boilerplate. And then we're using just a plain form element here. So we have a form that has a class name associated with it. And then inside of this form, we have different sections for each of the different attributes associated with the pizza model. So we have the size, which is a text input. We have the crust, another text input, toppings, another text input, and then the status, which is a select. And we also have an error down here because the select input is the only one that I want to be editable on this. The other three inputs, I want them to be disabled. I just want them to be read-only so that somebody can glance at an order and see what information is associated with it. And now these components came with Laravel Breeze automatically, and they're styled nicely using Tailwind CSS and are basically just boilerplate that kind of abstracts out a lot of the markup from creating forms. So there's not a whole lot of functionality behind these. But what we need to do now is we need to pass in values into each of these components. So in the text input for the size, we need the pizza's size attribute. And we can do the same thing for each of these. So for crust, the value is pizza crust. For the toppings, it's pizza toppings. And because it's an array, we'll use join, and we'll have it joined by a comma and a space. And then the status needs a set of options as well as a value. So the value is pizza status, but we don't have any options associated with this select input yet. So let's go ahead and create those. We'll call these just status options. And it'll be an array of all the options associated with each particular order. So now we can use that status options object inside of our select input. And let's go back to our main edit page and implement this form so we can see it on the front end. So we have update pizza order form, and we pass in the pizza prop that we are getting from our pizza controller. And then this also wants a class name, which we'll just do as max width extra large. So now let's go ahead and see if we can see this on the front end. Okay, so we have our form here. We can scroll down. And we see we have the size, the crust, and the toppings, which are all disabled and can't be edited. But the status here, we have the different options, and it's already selected the one that is currently associated with our particular order. And we have our Save Changes button down here as well. The problem, though, is that this form as it stands is not functional. If we go ahead and try to save that, nothing happens because we have no action or method associated with this form. But we don't want it to be submitted using the typical browser submission. We want to do it asynchronously so that we maintain the SPA appearance of our application. And we're using inertia, so we want to do it the inertia way. And so in order to do that, we use the onSubmit method for this form. And then we pass in a function that will be fired whenever this form's submission starts. So we'll just call this submit. And let's go ahead and scroll up here, and above our status options, let's create a new constant called submit, and it is a function that takes in the event, and we'll call prevent default on that so that the submission doesn't actually go through to the browser. It doesn't fire off the way that it's supposed to. And instead what we need to do is we need to move all of the data that's associated inside of the form to the pizza's update route that we had created earlier. Now, off the top of your head, you might reach for something like fetch, grab all of the data inside of this component, and then pass it through that. But Inertia has a really, really easy way to do this because it has a built-in way to work with forms. And that is something called the useForm method. So what we need to do first is pass in a bunch of initial values for the form attributes that are going to be used below. So if we look down at the form that we had created, again, we have size, we have the crust, we have toppings, and we have a status. So these are the default initial values we need to do for this useForm method. So we have size, and we need to give it a default initial value. So that is just the pizza size. The prop that we had passed in, we're using that as the initial value. Likewise for crust. For toppings, it's that array that is joined together like we did down below. And then for status, pizza status. Now, what does this give back to us when we use this? Well, it gives us back a bunch of different attributes depending on how you want to use this in your component. So we get back a data object and a setData method, and these work just like React's state. So data is associated with the current data set that is part of these initial values, and then setData allows us to change those values and keep the reactivity associated with them to use in other parts of the component or application. We also have different methods associated with how we want this form to be used in the component. So we have put, get, post, delete, but the one that we're looking for is patch. Remember, in our routes web file, we're using the patch method here to send those updates over to the controller. So we're going to match that by using the patch method in here. We can have an errors bag that gives us any errors associated with this form. We have a processing boolean that determines whether or not the form is currently in the middle of processing data. And we have a recently successful boolean as well, which gives us back a true value if the form was recently submitted successfully. And I'll show you how we're going to use each one of these below. So first off, for the submission, this is really easy. All we do is we call the patch method and pass in a URL to it. So for us, we're using that route object because we are using Ziggy, so we have access to the named Laravel routes. And for us, that's pizza's update. And we just pass in the additional value that's needed for that, which is the ID of the pizza. So pizza ID. And that is it. Whenever the form is submitted, this single line here will take all of the data associated with this form that is reactive and send it to this route with this method associated with it. So let's go ahead and continue downward. And for each of the different inputs, instead of calling the pizza size attribute, we're going to call the data size attribute. So that way we're using the dynamic data from that useForm method from inertia in each of our inputs. So again, data crust, data toppings, and we don't need this join method because that was being used in our initial data set above, and data status. So now back in our front end, we can see that everything has remained basically the same, but it's the reactivity behind the scenes that we've made adjustments to. So if I wanted to, I should be able to change this from prepping to baking and submit the form. Ooh, except whenever I change this, we can see it goes right back to prepping. That's really weird. Well, it's because we are updating the data or attempting to update the data from this form, but the client has no way of updating that data. It's using the constant state that is in the data attribute from inertia. And that's where we're going to use that setData method. So on the select input, whenever there's a change, so on change, we want to take that event and we want to set the data of status to the target value of that event. So whenever this select input has been changed, we're going to take that value and we're going to set the data attribute for status to whatever it was changed to. So now if we go back to our front end and we change the status to something like baking, we can see that data was automatically changed to the associated status. Now we can go ahead and try to save this, but remember, we didn't do anything inside of our controller. We have an empty update method down here. So let's add some functionality to this. And all we need to do is we are updating one attribute in here, which is the status. Remember, we don't want to change anything else inside this pizza model for right now. So we can just update the status to whatever the request status attribute is that comes through. And that's it. We shouldn't return anything from here unless there's an error. The front end will just assume this went through fine and that recently successful attribute will be true on our form. So how do we use that? Well, back in our update pizza order form section, underneath the save changes button, I'm going to go ahead and use this transition class from the React Headless UI library. So this will show only if recently successful is true. So what this means is that whenever the form is saved, we should see a small flash of this saved text down here for a few seconds before it fades back away. And so let's go scroll down here, change this to baking and hit save. And yeah, we saw save flash up and then disappear. But you can see that whenever we save this form, it pops back up to the top here. And we don't really want that. We want it to stay wherever the user had scrolled to. This isn't navigating us away or anything, so we should stay at the same scroll point as we were before. And in order to make that happen, all I need to do is go up to the submit method up here. And when I'm using this patch method, I can just pass in a object consisting of options. And the only one I'm looking for is the preserve scroll option set to true. So what that will do is that whenever this form is submitted, it'll remember wherever we are scrolled to and maintain that same position. So now if I go back and I update this to checking and I hit save, we can see that we didn't pop back to the top of the page. We remain in the same location. All right, and the last thing that I want to do with these options that we got from this use form method is I want to have a place to show errors and use this processing boolean as well. So if we scroll down here, I have a section for errors already with this input error class, and I can just pass in a message attribute to it, and it'll be the errors object. And for the processing boolean, usually what you want to have happen with forms is that you want to disable the submission button whenever the form is processing. So we can give this disabled attribute the processing boolean, and so the primary button for the form that saves the changes for it will be disabled whenever the form is actually processing. So it's good for preventing things from being submitted as the form is already submitting. All right, I think our backend is looking good at this point. So we gave our users the ability to have a view of all of these orders, be able to click in the details for them, and then adjust the status of each order. And all this leads us to being able to display this on a nice front end. So let's go ahead and get right into that. So like with every other route, I'm going to start with our routes web file. I'm going to create a route that is public to have a user be able to look at their order and see what the current status of it is. So let's go ahead and create a route get, and we'll have it be order, and then the pizza object underneath that order. And we'll have this go to a new class that is separate from our class that handles all of the backend pizza methods. So we'll keep this blank for now, and we'll call this public pizzas show. Let's go ahead and create that controller class, PHP artisan make controller, and we'll call this public pizza controller. Okay, and that's the name that we will use inside of our array here. So public pizza controller class, and we'll call it the show method. So let's go ahead and open up that class and create the method. And because again, we're using route model binding, we automatically get access to the pizza object associated with this order. So if I return that pizza object, just like before, if we go ahead and take this order, we'll open up a new tab. And if we go to localhost order and then our order number, we see that we get all of the data associated with that particular pizza. But again, like everything else, we don't want to display just the raw data. We want to return a component. So we return inertia, render, and then the component name. So this one I will keep underneath all of our other pizza components. So we'll do pizzas and we'll just call this show. And then for the props, we'll pass in the pizza just like we did for our edit component. Now let's just type in the return. It's an inertia response and go ahead and create this component. Show.jsx underneath the pizzas folder in our pages directory. So unlike all of our other components, we don't have an auth prop being passed in here because this isn't a route that's underneath the auth group. So the only prop that we have passing in here is the pizza. And let's go ahead and just make sure everything is working as expected. So if we go ahead and pass in the ID, we should see this in the front end now. And yep, we do. So we see the order number and the text that we had passed in. But we need to create a nice display to actually show the order process. Now, unlike the last couple of components that we created, I'm not going to be extending any of the other layouts that we have. So it's not going to look at the dashboard, and it's also not going to look at the welcome screen either. This will just be a blank page showing our pizza status tracker. So let's start out with a nice couple of wrapper divs and give this a logo. So now on the front end, we have this here. We have our Dice logo for Dice's Pizza. And speaking of which, if we go back here, we see that we don't have a title for the page in the tab. So let's change that. Underneath the parent tag of our component, we can use the head attribute that we get from inertia and provide a title. We'll just call this order number and then plus the pizza ID. So now going back, we see that we have that in the title. Okay, so we have our logo. Now what do we need next? We need to display the actual status of the pizza. In order to do that though, I think that'll be best abstracted out to another component in this partials directory. So let's go ahead and create one. We'll call this pizzastatus.jsx. And I don't know what we're going to be using in this for props yet, so we'll just leave this blank, but we will include it here on the front end. And then underneath the status, I'm thinking that we also have another div that has some kind of text in here that shows what the last status of the pizza is and how long ago it happened. So maybe we include the chef who created it. So we have that chef attribute for the user's name, and we can say they started whatever the status of the order is. So pizza status to lowercase. So if it's, oh, Andrew started checking your order, Andrew started baking your order. So Andrew started blank your order. And then we should have some kind of time element too. So pizza, we'll call this like last updated. And for this, we'll wrap this in a span that's underlined and semi-bold. Now this last updated attribute we don't have yet. That's another appends that I think we should add to the pizza model. So inside of the appends array, let's also add a last updated. And I want this to be like, I don't know, like 6 minutes ago or 12 hours ago or whatever. And so in order to do that, we can actually, well, first we'll create the attribute model. So get last updated attribute. And this will be returning back a string. And we're going to return back this. So we get the pizza model. And let's get the updated at timestamp. And by default, the timestamps from a Laravel model, the updated at and the created at, are carbon objects. So they use the carbon PHP library. And so we can use methods on there to manipulate the data that comes out. So we can call diff for humans on it. And that will actually give us a difference between the current time and whatever the time underneath the updated at attribute is currently at. So that'll give us exactly what we're looking for. And then we can go ahead and use that in the component. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what this looks like so far. Okay, so we see that we have our chef's name and they started baking my order an hour ago. So that lines up perfectly with the last time that this order was updated. But we don't have our status tracker up here yet. So let's go ahead and create that. So let's create a div with a nice border around it. And I need to go through each of the statuses and set a class depending on whether or not the current object has that status associated with it, or if it has already passed that status. So what I mean by that is let's start out with an array of our possible statuses. And then we need to create a div for each of these statuses. So let's go ahead and map those out to a status and an index. And we'll return back a div with the key set to the index. And we need a specific class name generated per div. Because if they were all the same name, they're all going to have the same style, but that's not what I want. I want each div to be different depending on what the current status of the order is. And then inside of these, let's display a number for each of the statuses. This is going to be set to the index +1 because we start out with a 0 index, but I want the first number to be 1. And then we just display the status underneath of that. So, okay, what we need to do is we need to start generating this class name for each of these divs. So let's base it on a method instead. So this will be unique per of these 5 status divs. We'll call this method getClass. And it'll take in that status and that index. And for now, let's just return a list of the same classes. So if we go ahead and replace the class name with this function, so getClass, and we pass in the status and index to it, what does this look like on the front end? Okay, well, we're getting somewhere. So we see we have each of these 5 divs broken up. We can kind of see the the text underneath of them if I highlight it, but right now it's because there is no background on each of them. So we need to start working on what each of these looks like. So let's set this string of classes. I want this to be kind of like the base of each of these sections. So we can call this base classes. And then I'm going to add on specific classes depending on what the status is that's being passed to me and what the status of the actual pizza is coming in as well. So that should probably be our prop. I don't need the whole pizza object. I just need this status associated with it. So we'll call this current status. That's the prop that's passed in. And I can reflect that in our show component as well. So current status is pizza status. So now let's go through and think about the different classes that are going to be used whenever this method is called on each of those 5 divs. So, okay, first we need to denote what the active status is. So to do that, we can say, all right, if the status that's being passed to us is the exact same as the current status, then we can go ahead and return base classes, and we'll add in some styles that are associated with an active status state. So how about a red gradient and a bit of a pop out with this scale here? Now, if the status has already passed through, so if it's in the middle, we need the 2 before that. What styles are those going to have and how do we find them? Well, we can say if the status's index of, based on the current status, is greater than the current index we're looping over, that means that these are below the currently active item. So we can return base classes and then some styles that would give an appearance of, all right, these have finished up. So how about a dark blue gradient? And the default are the remaining statuses, the ones that are after the current active item. So again, we can return base classes and then tack on a style associated with that. So I think for that, we can do a light blue gradient. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like now on the front end. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So we see these 2 here have already finished up. We have an active class in the middle, and we have these 2 that have yet to start. But we do have some slight adjustments we need to make. So this needs to be rounded over here, and this needs to be rounded over here, and this border needs to drop off as well as this border here for the active state. So let's go back and rethink some of our conditionals here. So for the first one, that's pretty easy. If the index is the first index, then we need to add to the base classes to round that out. Now, I feel like in my comments, people are going to be saying, if you just use vanilla CSS, this would not be an issue, but I like my life difficult and I like Tailwind. So that's what I'm using here. And that's why we have to go through these conditionals to conditionally build the style for each div. There also might be an easier way to do this with Tailwind, but again, just making my life more difficult. We can see that we have the left now rounded out. We need to replicate that on the right-hand side. So instead of it being the first index, we need to say, all right, if the current index is the same as the length of the statuses, -1, which would be the last index of this, then base classes need to equal base classes replace border R2 with rounded R full. The reason that we're using replace here instead of just adding on to this like here is we also need to get rid of the border that was on this right side here. So it's kind of getting rid of both of these things at once. And so the only thing left that we need to adjust is the border on the active status section. So let's head on to the current status conditional, and we can just call base classes replace like we did above, except we're replacing border R2 with nothing. So just get rid of it. All right, and our front end is looking solid as far as design goes. And we're almost done with this. The last remaining piece that we need is I want to have this live update. So right now, if we go back to the order section here, this is the same order, and we change baking to checking. Let's go ahead and save that. Back on the front end, we don't see any kind of update until we hit refresh. And then we can see both the status itself and the little timer down here has changed. But it stays the same. It only updates if I refresh, and then I get some new data. But I want this to happen in near real time. So there are a couple ways to do this based on difficulty. So if we wanted to do this near real time with communication from both the backend and the front end, we could use WebSockets. If we wanted just a one-way connection near real time from the backend to the front end, we could use something like server-sent events. But in all honesty, because we're using inertia and this doesn't need to be near real time, I'm just going to opt for an easy method, which is just polling. And this can actually be fully implemented with just a couple of lines. So normally you might think, oh, okay, well, I need to create some kind of interval in my component. And then every second or a few moments, I need to go and fetch some data from the API and swap it out with what's in here. And this is the case, but inertia lets you do this really easily. And I'm about to show you how. So like we said before, we need to set an interval in here to poll every X amount of time that we want to. So let's create a use effect hook. And this is going to create a set interval that will fire off, let's do every second. You could probably do every 5 or every 10 seconds, but because I'm doing this locally and I'm really not that worried about hitting this endpoint multiple times, we're going to do this every second. And the dependencies for use effect are empty, so that this only runs once. And then I'm also going to want to remove this interval whenever the component is navigated away from or destroyed, just in case. So let's go ahead and say this is const interval. And on our destroy return, we're going to clear interval. Okay, so what do we need to do each second that happens? So thinking about it, you probably want to be able to fetch the data and then replace what's in the component with the new data. And that's the case, but believe it or not, it's a one line to do this in inertia. So all we need to do is use the router object from inertia and call reload. And then we pass in an array of options. So using the only method, which takes an array, we call the props that we want to have reloaded in the page, and that is it. By using router reload, and saying, all right, I only want to reload the pizza prop that is in here. So that'll get us the ID, the status, and the chef, and the last updated at, and all of the data associated with this particular model. This means that every second behind the scenes, inertia is going to call the same endpoint that was called to render this component, but only get back the data that is needed, in this case, just the pizza object. And then it's going to hot swap all of the data associated with that prop into the attribute and components below and give us a basically live reload. So let's see what this looks like. So okay, I'm back on the front end and let's go ahead and open up our dev tools. If we go to the network tab here, you can see every second we are hitting that endpoint. And if we open it up and look at the response back, we can see that we're getting the component back and the only props associated with it. Now, yes, we are only using the pizza prop in general, but if we had more than one, we would only see this object as the one being passed through as the response in these API calls. So how do we know this is happening in near real time with our updates? So let's go ahead and open up this in like a split view mode. Okay, so on my left, I have the order in the dashboard, and on my right, I have my view showing my pizza status. Now let's go ahead and update this to ready. And all right, we saw that we had an instant save, and then we saw on the front end that we had a near real-time update to the ready status. And this works backwards as well. So if I accidentally mess up the order and drop it on the floor and I need to go back to prepping, I can save that, and it went back to the prepping status almost immediately. And then as each second passes, we can see that our time is going up, but this data here that's being rendered is from the actual backend of the application. It's coming from the database as the source of truth and isn't just being updated on the front end. So yeah, now I can go through each of these steps until my pizza is ready. And yeah, so this is our pizza tracker, and we created it with Laravel and React with the help of inertia. I hope you enjoyed putting this project together with me. Let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions for any new topics or projects, or any frameworks or libraries you'd like to see me build something with. And as always, thanks for watching.